1857 to 1900. Um, so we'll start with the Indian Mutiny, okay, in 1857. Now this is the first sort of event that you'll discover, and the first sort of event that you'll actually write about in your NEA, in your coursework, after your introduction. So a little bit of background on the Indian Mutiny and what caused it. Now, one of the sort of longer term causes of the Indian Mutiny during the period of the East India Company was this sort of westernization, okay? The British attempts to modernize and westernize India through their cultural imperialist sentiments, okay? So that for the Indians formed a sort of lack of respect for their own customs and traditions. Another sort of longer term cause of the Indian Mutiny was the fact that they were being heavily taxed economically, okay, and that they were being economically drained by the East India Company through British economic imperialism. One of the immediate sort of causes of the Indian Mutiny, though, was the fact that the Enfield rifle cartridges, which the sepoys in India, the sort of the army in India at the time, which were made up of Indians, the sort of Enfield rifle cartridges that they were required to use, they were sort of greased with pig and cow fat, okay? And those cartridges, they were required to be bitten by the Indian sepoys using them, and obviously that created problems in terms of offending Hindu and Muslim religious practices, because the cow is sacred for Hindus, and obviously the pig is sacred for, pig is not to be eaten by Muslims. So that offended their religious practices, and what that led to was in the Indian Mutiny. So rebellions breaking out in different regions in India, which then began to spread across the whole nation. Whilst the causes of the Indian Mutiny are really, really important, what we're primarily concerned with is the consequences of Indian Mutiny, and these will link to each of the three different questions that you'll sort of pick from when deciding which question you choose to do for your NEA. So one of the main consequences of the Indian Mutiny is that it showed the British that Hindus and Muslims, they were capable of uniting together, they were capable of joining forces, okay, to attempt to get rid of the British, okay? So the British saw this as threatening to their rule, okay? They saw that the Hindu community and the Muslim community were willing to unite to attempt to overthrow the British in the form of an anti-colonial rebellion, okay? So what that meant to the British is that they needed to find a way going forwards of firstly not offending religious practices, and they also needed to find a way, secondly, of thinking about how they could divide and rule the different religious communities within India. If the British, through their imperialism, through their imperialist policies, if they were able to divide and rule the different religious communities in India, they would weaken the nationalist movement, okay? They would weaken the opposition to their rule within India amongst the Indians themselves, okay? And that would then strengthen their own grip over India as their colony, okay? So what we see is the sort of beginning of the divide and rule policy taking effect from the early 20th century, okay? Secondly, another sort of consequence which is really, really important is that the British began their rule oppressively, okay? So the Government of India Act was signed in 1858, and what the Government of India Act did is that it transferred all of the powers from the East India Company to the British Crown, which meant that India now became a formal colony of the British, and the British directly ruled them from Parliament in Westminster, okay? So the British now took direct sort of control over India as one of their colonies, okay? All powers transformed from the Crown from the East India Company to the crown. Okay, one of the most important points to make then is that as a result of the fact that as a result of the fact that the British began their rule oppressively, okay, the fact that it was founded upon violence and hostility through suppressing the Indian Mutiny, as the British did, it foreshadowed further violence and oppression as British rule went on. In Kim Wagner's book, a historian who wrote on Amritsar 1919, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919, it's called "The Making, an Empire of Fear and the Making of a Massacre." What Kim Wagner argues is that the 1857 Great Rebellion, the Indian Mutiny, okay, it sort of instills fear within the British of another anti-colonial rebellion. Okay, so after the 1857 Indian Mutiny, the British almost rule in fear of another anti-colonial rebellion taking place. So, as we'll discover in the second part of our chronology of key events next week, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre appeared to resemble the beginnings of a rebellion similar to the 1857 Indian Mutiny, which is why it was suppressed, okay, so quickly and so violently. Okay, so in relation to whether the British sought to create a peaceful, prosperous, and self-governing India, in particular, sort of this idea of peacefulness. One of the things that we need to remember with the Indian Mutiny is that it was founded upon violence and hostility. Okay, it was active oppression from the British to suppress this rebellion, and therefore, okay, this sort of violence, oppression, and hostility was likely to form a part of the British project in India going forwards. The 1857 Indian Mutiny is also seen as the beginning of the Indian nationalist movement, the attempt to establish self-rule and the attempt to overthrow the British from India. Next, we've got the Indian Councils Acts of 1861 and 1892. And what these sort of try and attempt to do is to establish advisory councils whereby Indians are sort of given more voice in the governance of their own affairs, in the making of laws that govern them. Okay, so the 1861 Indian Councils Act, it reorganized the Viceroy's Legislative Council and allowed provisional legislative councils to be set up. Okay, but members were chosen by Parliament. Okay, there were not elections. Okay, one of the most important things to realize here is that it did little, incredibly little, to improve the influence of Indians in the Legislative Council. Okay, so the role of the council was limited to advice. What we need to remember about the Indian Councils Acts of 1861 and 1892 is that they were merely advisory councils. Okay, the Indian influence was incredibly small at this stage. Okay, and they were merely giving advice. Okay, in 1892 this was extended. The council consisted of 24 members, but only 5 of those members who were sitting on those councils were Indian. Okay, so it allowed district boards, for example, to recommend additional members to the provincial legislative councils, but that was primarily educated Indians who took part in the consultative process. So it was primarily the Indian elites who were able to join the Europeans or the British on these councils. Okay. One of the most important things to remember is that the Viceroy also had the ability to exercise a veto, which means that any sort of proposals or policies passed by these legislative councils, the Viceroy of India at the time, the sort of the member presiding over India at the time, they could veto these proposals or these policies. Okay, which means that they could basically choose to ignore them and not acknowledge them and go along with their own sort of policies and provisions. And that was sort of the beginning of of this process of democratization, which really begins to accelerate from 1909 onwards. Okay, with the Morley-Minto reforms, which we'll discover next week. Okay, in 1885, we've got the establishment of the Indian National Congress. So in its early days, though, it's important to remember that the Indian National Congress, which was founded in 1885, it was merely a forum for discussion, okay? It was not a fully fledged anti-colonial movement. It was not a fully fledged political party, and it was just a forum for discussion about how they could begin to have a say in their sort of own affairs. Okay, so how they can begin to think about governing themselves in the future. So it was attended by wealthy, educated, high caste Indians, and at this stage, it was mainly just it, influence on policy and decision making was really, really minimal at this time. A lot of historians argue, and a lot of commentators argue that the establishment of the Indian National Congress was the beginnings of the nationalist movement in India, as opposed to the Great Rebellion of 1857. Okay. Um, Right. In the late 19th century, okay, we've also got the Indian social renaissance, and this is really, really important. So, as a result of the sort of introduction of British modernization and westernization in India, um, religious communities, primarily the Hindus, Muslims, and the Sikhs, they realize that they need to engage and embark on a program of religious revivalism. Okay, they need to establish their own separate identities. Okay, and they need to really bring um, the religious communities um, back into this sort of fold of recognizing their own identity as separate from the British to counter this sort of influence that the British are bringing with their own modernization and westernization. So you've got groups like the Arya Samaj, which was founded in 1875, and what they attempt to do is focus on education for Hindus, particularly the education of the Hindu elites. Okay, they prioritize sort of the Hindu language, the sacredness of the cow, for example, and they really begin to sort of mobilize Hindus around cultural symbols. Okay, the important thing to realize here is that the Hindus were a step ahead of the Muslims in particular. So the Aligarh College, which was also the Aligarh movement, which was also founded in 1875, okay, by Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, that attempted to also bring bring Muslims into line with their own identity, their own religious identity, in light of countering this sort of program of British modernization